All right, so we have another album on our hands that's a little bit of like a rejuvenization and a revitalization of an older work. And I've really loved those kinds of albums when they are handled properly, when they're basically just touching it up a little bit, meh, but when they really add something new to the, I guess, discourse that's going on within the actual music going on, we've got something very special. So let's dive into this one.
His love will take it all away.
For King and Country 2021 edition, released by Cyan. There's a little bit of a history with Cyan, which actually creates a really fun story. So Cyan is the project from Robert Reed. And for those of you in the know, Robert Reed is kind of the forerunner of Magenta. So it's actually kind of funny, you have Cyan and you have Magenta, and Cyan was his original project. He put out 3 albums with the moniker. They came out in the early 90s, so he was a little bit ahead of the curve of the kind of the retro prog that was really prominent in the mid to late 90s with bands like Spock's Beard and Flower Kings. The first 3 albums, the first one being For King and Country, Pictures from the Other Side, and The Creeping Vine. And they were received well enough, but when he had the opportunity to kind of break away from that and start up Magenta, he decided to do that, starting in 2001 with Revelations. And I love Magenta. Their 2017 album of We Are Legend was one of my favorite albums of that year, and it is paired very, very well with the new singer of Christina Booth. Her voice is just brilliant, and she actually appears a number of moments on this particular album that we're going to be talking about. So you can feel that very symphonic prog outfit on there. Like if you like Magenta, you're going to like what you hear on here. Where I feel though Magenta is a little bit more on the neo side of things, I feel like this is a little bit more on the retro side of things. And to kind of help kind of differentiate the two, I always feel like neo prog has the more 80s aesthetic to it, a little bit more melodramatic, theatrical in approach, whereas retro prog is a little bit more symphonic, it's a little bit more jovial, it's a little bit more of like a celebration of sound, attempting to really, really recapture the sounds from the 70s. And so that's where I'm feeling a little bit more with Cyan, and that's a little bit of an easier way to differentiate these two bands. The other main way to differentiate is you've got Christina Booth on Magenta. On Cyan, you have the brilliant and beautiful singer of Pete Jones. And for those of you that don't know Pete Jones, in my mind, he's one of the best and most underrated prog artists in our field right now. I believe he sings and does a lot of the keyboards now for Camel, as well as Tiger Moth, and the man can sing. He has one of the greatest singing styles of the current progressive rock. I do feel his voice, especially on this album, does feel a little bit indistinguishable from a lot of the other kind of retro prog singers that we have out there. If I were to listen to his vocals on something from like a Big Big Train or anything from like a Transatlantic, I feel like that singing style really would be lost in the fold, but I still think he has a powerhouse vocals. He's able to really hit those higher notes without needing to strain. He's able to really master those more somber and soulful moments without being too melodramatic. I think he's a perfect fit for the music that's coming onto this. And so talking about this album, we have 8 tracks from the original one that's being kind of brought forth. Now, I've never really heard the original one, so I don't really have too much to contrast and compare. And I will admit, upon my first listen, I always like to go into an album blind and not really know kind of any of the inner workings. And then after I've got a couple listens under my belt, I like to do a little bit more research just to kind of contextualize what I've been hearing. And it was a really interesting experiment for me because when I was listening to this, much like a good retro prog outfit, it feels both timeless and timely. And what I mean by that is when you listen to retro prog, just because it is trying to recapture the sounds from the 70s, it doesn't really have a flavor of being modern at any time. Like, it doesn't really feel like it could be found from the 90s, 20s, 2010s, or even now into the 2020s. So even though a lot of these songs were written like 20, 30 years ago. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like this could be retro prog that we could have been hearing today. In fact, when I first listened to this, I'm like, great, this is some really interesting new retro prog. I know it's a little bit of an oxymoron, but it felt fresh, it felt new, it felt very rejuvenizing. And then once I found out that these tracks were written like 20, 30 years ago, I'm like, oh, okay. I mean, that kind of goes for the craft. You know, that really showcases how well these tracks were originally conceived and structured. So in that sense, I think this is a really good album in terms of just the music that's surrounding it. But there are a lot of songs on here that do feel a little dated. They do feel a little bit out of place. A lot of the tracks I'm listening to, I kind of pinpoint the influences that are on here, right? Like, I feel like the influences are definitely worn on the sleeve, specifically with the 5th track of Snowbound. It brought me right back to like a Steve Hackett or a Genesis, something from either Voyage of the Acolyte or Wind and Wuthering. Both of these feels are very prominent on here. This album does have some really powerhouse tracks and ones that I really do enjoy, but there are also a lot of tracks on here that I'm not a huge fan of. And I want to talk about those that I like first. I think the album opens up very, very well with the best track being The Sorcerer. I love the storyline behind it. It's very Arthurian, but really the sorcerer is Merlin and talking about his exploits and his journeys. And I think opening up with the big epic was a really good choice. It really grabbed my attention, really got me into it, and I love the ebb and flow. The ending on this was very, very satisfying. I think it was a great crescendo, a great build up, overall an excellent prog piece. Unfortunately, we come into about 3 tracks after that I'm not a huge fan of. Call Me, Don't Turn Away, and I Defy the Sun. All 3 of these tracks aren't all that exciting for me. There's not a whole lot to really grab onto. I will admit, my first couple of listens on there, they were pretty good, they were fine, but the more I listened to it, the less I got out of it. I wasn't as excited about these tracks. I wasn't really looking forward to them as they were coming around the run times. I did like how I Defy the Sun is a little bit more on the mellow side, and I believe Christina Booth's vocals are on here. Her vocals soar on this. And I will admit, these like first 4 tracks do have a lot of the more like British minstrels. We're hearing a lot of horn sections on there, especially from Don't Turn Away, where we have this like it feels like Rick Wakeman's King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Very big and very verbose. I will actually admit, I do like the 2 instrumental pieces that we have on here. I already mentioned Snowbound, and Snowbound might be my second favorite track after The Sorcerer. I really love where the song goes. I really love the playing styles on here, even if there are a number of moments on here, specifically with the synth that sounds like it's a flute that is almost pulled directly off of Voyage of the Acolyte from Steve Hackett. The other track that's instrumental is the second last track of Night Flight. I really like this track. I love the groove of this. It's ebbing and flowing. It's shifting styles. We almost have like this calypso dance movement near the midpoint, but I'm loving more of the synth sounds that we have on there, a little bit darker, a little bit like grimier in that sense. But I just love the ebb and flow and the twists and turns of this track. It's almost 8 minutes long, but it never really feels the runtime. Everybody's playing at top notch. I love the guitar work on here. It's got some really like meaty guitar licks that we have on there. I'm loving that it's almost battling and dancing with the keyboard work. So it's a very nice dance that's constructed on there. And the track between Snowbound and Night Flight, Man Amongst Men, it's fine. It's the second longest track at almost 12 minutes, but I feel like this one does feel the runtime. It does wander a little bit. It doesn't have that same kind of a punch that the Sorcerer has. And at no point do I really feel like the runtime justifies the length. Like there's no real cause for it. Like I don't really think back on anything particularly that I really, really enjoyed with that. Now the same can't be said for the closing track, which is my third favorite piece on here, which is For King and Country. And it in of itself is a little bit of like an anti-war track, which I'm all for. I think that's a great message to be sending out. I do think that in terms of this theme and this messaging. I do feel like other bands have tackled this a little bit better, and I'm looking at like IQ and The Tangent, but I do enjoy the music that's around this. I think that it's a really brilliant ending piece. I think it caps off the album very, very well, even though I do feel as though that final crescendo left me wanting more, and not necessarily in a good way, and more of a, oh, this is it? Okay, well, I thought there was going to be a little bit more. I just wonder if there could have been like one or two moments on there that really could have like stood out as being some of the better moments on the album overall. So in the end, the album King and Country was a good time. I found myself enjoying it each time I sat down to listen to it, but as with most retro prog, I like to spend a little bit more time with it after I initially start to formulate my ideas about it. Mainly because I find the more time I spend with an album, it really gives me a solid idea of, do I really, really like this album, or am I just excited for more retro prog? And I feel like I'm on the latter. I feel like I was just excited for some more retro prog, and then once I finally digested the music, got used to it, got into it, I started to get a little bit of diminishing returns. I felt like every time I started to listen to this album, I wasn't a big fan of it. And I do think that some of those early tracks like Call Me, I Define the Sun, and Don't Turn Away did kind of lose me a little bit, and it wasn't until Snowbound that I got my attention back into it. There's still enough on this album to get excited about, like The Sorcerer, like Snowbound, like Night Fight, and for the title track of King and Country. But this isn't necessarily one that I would go out and run for. Like, this wouldn't be an introductory album for retro prog. This wouldn't be one that I would highly recommend. This would be one that if you love retro prog, if you love neo prog, if you love magenta, this would be one that I would definitely go and check out. So in the end, I would say for King and Country by Cyan, it's one that I would stream. Which kind of brings me to my last point here. This isn't available for stream. You have to either go to the Bandcamp page and purchase it. And this is one that, for me personally, I wouldn't purchase. I mean, I want to support the band. I want to, give them all good things. But like, as an individual with a very limited budget, I do have to kind of pick and choose which albums I want to have in my collection, and unfortunately this one just doesn't quite make the cut for me. So that's kind of where I'm at for this one. But what do you guys think? Do you love it? Do you hate it? It's been out now. I think it was released last Friday, so let me know of your own thoughts about this album by commenting down below. And if you like what you see and you want to help support me and help support bands, because that's generally where all my money goes to, check out my Patreon. I've left the link down below. It's patreon.com/notesreviews. Even $1 a month goes quite a long way. And just think you're helping me support bands. So, and that's about it. So thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.
Silently